Hey everybody, this is a piece by James Muldoon titled The Birth of Council Communism. It's from the edited volume The German Revolution and Political Theory. Workers' councils arose spontaneously during the revolutionary uprisings of 1917 to 19 period in Russia and Europe. The spread of councils across Germany in early 1918 appeared to mirror the initial formation of councils in Russia. Socialists hoped that the German Revolution would be the beginning of a proletarian revolution in Western Europe. However, such predictions proved inaccurate as Germany transitioned to the democratic republican institutions of the Weimar Republic, leading to the dissipation of the council movements in Germany. Nevertheless, it was in the German and Dutch section of the Communist International that Council Communism first developed. The term Council Communism was distinguished from official communism, started to be used in 1921. Among its early proponents were Antonie Pannekoek, Herman Gorter, and Henriette Roland Holst in the Netherlands, and Otto Rühle, Karl Korsch, Karl Schröder, Franz Pfeffert, Karl Plättner, Gustav Landauer, Erich Mühsam, and Paul Mattick in Germany. At its core, council communism is a theory of working-class struggle and revolution based on the principle of the self-emancipation of the working class and the organizational form of workers' councils as the most effective means to overthrow capitalism and to establish the basis of a new society. Previous studies of council communism have tended to emphasize the dispute between Lenin and the council communists over interpretations of the Russian Revolution and a Leninist model of revolutionary strategy, such as in Rachlev, 1976, and Marcel van der Linden in 2004. This chapter demonstrates the pivotal importance of the German Revolution on the development of council communist thought. The political experience of the German council movement was essential because it tested the viability of Lenin's political strategy in Western Europe. The starting point of the split between Lenin and the group called the quote left and quote communist was over the universal applicability of Russian strategies. The failure of the German Revolution provided evidence to council communists of the specificity of the Bolshevik model to Russia and the need to develop new strategies for Germany. See Pannekoek, 1920. In particular, theorists such as Antonie Pannekoek, Otto Rühle, and Karl Korsch came to the conclusion that the ultimate reason for the failure of the German Revolution was the resilience of the stronghold of bourgeois mentalities over workers. They believed that bourgeois ideology was reinforced through participation in parliamentary institutions and traditional party and union organizations. While political power had passed temporarily into the hands of workers during the revolution, council delegates had freely voted for the formation of a constituent assembly and the disempowerment of the councils. When the Bolsheviks promoted their model of revolution as an international strategy within the Communist International, it was not so much the course of the Russian Revolution which was in question, but rather the lessons of the German Revolution. Although council communists would develop a critique of the centralization and bureaucratization of the Russian Revolution, the initial split occurred over the question of revolutionary strategy in Europe. Council communists were critical of the proposed replacement of the self-organization of the working class with the direction of a party and union leadership, and advocated instead for workers' councils as a proletarian form of organization for empowering workers. This chapter also traces a shift in theorists' understanding of the workers' councils during and after the German Revolution. It urges that while participants in the revolution, such as the revolutionary shop stewards, were more inclined to view the councils as the initial structure of a post-capitalist society, this shifted in later council communist ideology, which arose in the early 1920s after the realistic possibilities of establishing a council republic had already faded from view. Peter Ratcliffe claims, quote, workers' councils does not designate a fixed form of organization, elaborated once and for all, and for which all that remains is to perfect the council's details. It concerns a principle of workers' self-management of the enterprise and of production, end quote. While this may be true for certain council communists, it was not the case for many participants in the council movements. A long tradition within council thought, from Marx's writings on the Paris Commune to the theoretical elaboration of a council system by Richard Müller and Ernst Daumig, and the writings of Cornelius Castoriadis, has sought to demonstrate how specific institutional features of a council form are superior to bourgeois and liberal political institutions. The outlines of council communism did not emerge immediately during the experience of workers' councils in the German Revolution. Rather, they emerged gradually through theoretical debates within the Communist International. In the early stages of the International, key theorists still supported aspects of the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Party's program. For example, Herman Gorter declared Lenin the revolutionary, quote, who surpasses all other leaders of the proletariat, end quote, while in 1919 Pannekoek still considered the Russian Revolution a communist revolution. When theorists did begin to shift on their understanding of the Russian Revolution and other issues of principle and strategy, they did not move as one. Council communism developed in the early 1920s primarily through debates between Lenin, Gorter, Rühle, and Pannekoek, in which council communists grew increasingly more critical of the prospects of the Russian Revolution and Bolshevism. This chapter provides an outline of these debates in order to unpack the development of council communist ideology following the experiences of the German Revolution. New section. From the Räterepublik to council communism. Räterepublik would be a council republic, or Republic of Councils in German. Councils initially arose spontaneously in Germany through a sailors' revolt which began in Kiel on the 4th of November 1918 and quickly spread across the old German Empire. The councils arose without significant theoretical elaboration, leading participants in the council movements to have to improvise their structure and purpose. It was widely considered that some form of socialization of key industries would be an important practical task of the workers' councils, much concerning their institutional structure and primary activities remaining undefined. Richard Müller and Ernst Daumig of the Revolutionary Shop Stewards sought to provide a theorization of the workers' councils according to a, quote, pure, end quote, council system, which was their outline for a lasting institutionalization of the council as a replacement for parliamentary democracy. Ralph Hofrogge, has provided an excellent account of Müller and Daumig's theory of a council system, published in their newspaper Der Arbeiterrat, the Worker Council, established in February 1919. As Hofrogge explains, quote, in the spirit of Marx and Engels, Müller and Daumig saw their model as both a radical form of democracy and a dictatorship of the proletariat understood as the class dominance of the working class, end quote. In these early articles, workers' councils were envisaged as the institutional basis for a future German council republic, in which a pyramidal scheme of economic and political councils would assume political authority and manage economic production. Daumig argued that the main goal of the council system was, quote, the removal of capitalist production and the implementation of socialist production, end quote. A distinction can be drawn between the practices of the European council movements in the immediate post-war revolutionary period and the council communist ideology that developed during the early 1920s. Following the failure of the German Revolution and the bureaucratization of the Russian council state, the emphasis of certain council theorists shifted from the councils as a distinctively proletarian institutional framework of a post-capitalist council state, end quote, to a more ambiguous organizational structure, which facilitated the mass action of the entire working class rather than a party or bureaucratic elite. While Müller and Daumig had always been closer to the former position, theorists such as Pannekoek and Korsch tended towards the latter. During the period 1917 to 1921, there was a decline in the perceived importance of an institutional plan for a council republic, and a movement towards an understanding of the councils as a method of struggle in an ongoing revolutionary process. The council communist tendency is commonly dismissed as a utopian current of ultra-leftism that remained fixated on workers' councils as embodying the experience of the workers themselves outside of any form of mediation, whether party, union, or state. See, for instance, Dauvé, 2015. Critics claim that Lenin rightly condemned this misguided ideology in his polemical pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, for rejecting party discipline, political leadership, and strategic participation in trade unions and parliaments. Lenin argued that the left communist strategies would lead to organizational incapacity and a lack of unity and direction. Following Lenin's criticism, Gilles Dauvé, 2015, later complained that council communism developed into a rigid and undialectic ideology of, quote, councilism, in which rejection of trade unions and parties became an article of blind faith rather than a considered strategy of working-class struggle. However, the council communists deserve more than a small footnote to Pannekoek as one of Lenin's defeated rivals in the history of Marxism. Their emphasis on workers' self-emancipation led them to reflect upon a wide variety of issues related to the councils, which produced a rich body of literature irreducible to the simplistic image of quote, councilism, end quote, that now predominates. While council communists shared a common general direction and set of animating concerns, the council communists differed widely in their political positions on key issues. Reflection on the council led to an array of different political analyses, institutional models, revolutionary strategies, and visions of a post-capitalist future. What is at stake is more than a simple organizational question of councils versus party. The origins of the council communist tradition lie in the theoretical disputes that occurred within the Dutch and German far left in the early 20th century and later in the development of opposition movements to the war during the First World War in Germany. On the theoretical front, theorists such as Pannekoek and Luxemburg argued against Kautsky that class consciousness needed to be developed not only through a bureaucratic party or trade union, but also in the course of a mass strike and revolutionary class struggle. They favored more spontaneous forms of action and more direct forms of workers' control than that available within the established unions and parties. In practical terms, socialists who opposed the SPD's decision to grant war credits to fund the German war effort would soon advocate for workers' councils and would go on to found groups such as the USPD, or the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, Spartacus League, and KPD, the Communist Party of Germany. In January 1917, as the anti-war socialists were expelled from the SPD, plans are already underway for the creation of a new party of the left with a different organizational structure and revolutionary strategies. In order to unpack some of the complexities of the council communist political thought, I will consider how theoretical debates within the movement developed along 6 main axes. 1. Reflections on revolutionary conditions in Russia and Western Europe. 2. Criticisms of the centralization and bureaucratization of the Russian state under the Bolshevik Party. 3. Questions of the councils as a working-class government or revolutionary process. 4. Considerations of the role of revolutionary leadership. 5. Debates on the relationship between the councils and communist parties. 6. Refusal of participation in parliamentary elections. New section, revolutionary conditions. Actually, I'm going to save this for later. Revolutionary conditions. First, the basis of one of the fundamental differences between the Bolsheviks and the Council Communists can be found in Herman Gorter's open letter in response to Lenin's Left Communism pamphlet. Gorter argued that strategic disagreements between them were founded on different underlying analyses of class relations and the revolutionary conditions in Russia and Western Europe. Gorter questioned the applicability of Lenin's strategies because, quote, the condition of the Western European Revolution, especially in England and Germany, are entirely unlike, and cannot be compared with those of the Russian Revolution, end quote, Gorter, 1920. For Gorter, the Russian proletariat had the good fortune of the support of the poor peasants during the revolution, whereas, quote, the workers in Western Europe stand all alone, end quote. Gorter considered that the lack of natural allies of the workers and the dominance of the bourgeoisie posed a greater challenge for the European proletariat that required more attentiveness to developing its own power and autonomy rather than relying on other classes for support. Gorter did not consider participation in trade unions and parliamentary elections to be effective strategies under these less favorable circumstances. Quote, as the Third International does not believe in the fact that in Western Europe the proletariat will stand alone, it neglects the mental development of this proletariat, which in every respect is deeply entangled in the bourgeois ideology as yet, and chooses tactics which leave the slavery and subjection to bourgeois ideas unmolested, intact, end quote. Pannekoek agreed with Gorter on the fundamental difference in political context of Western Europe in comparison to Russia. Pannekoek argued that the experience of the failed German Revolution offered further proof of the difficulty of successful revolution in the West because, quote, the forces which came to the fore in Germany are by and large at work throughout the rest of Europe, end quote. In his insightful 1920 essay, World Revolution and Communist Tactics, Pannekoek also emphasized the strength of the old bourgeois mentalities over the masses, a dominance that he argued would be further entrenched if parliamentary politics and trade union tactics were employed. Quote, the spiritual and mental character of the masses here is quite different from that of the Eastern countries, where they had not experienced this domination of bourgeois culture, and herein above all lies the difference in the progress of the revolution in the East and in the West, end quote. Pannekoek, 1920, World Revolution and Communist Tactics. Furthermore, Pannekoek was convinced that the spread of revolution from Russia to the West in the abortive 1918 German Revolution demonstrated that conditions were increasingly fertile for more active confrontations with the state. For Pannekoek, the First World War marked the end of a long peaceful period of the growth of capitalism and the beginning of a more direct and antagonistic struggle led by the working class through their own political activities. What can be seen from these analyses is that the Council Communist advocacy of workers' councils was based not on an assertion of dogmatic principles, but on a careful assessment of the class relations and future potential for revolutionary activity. Their various positions on this point, along with many others, were more nuanced than is commonly perceived. Criticisms of the Russian Revolution. Second, Council Communism also developed a critique of the Russian Revolution as a bourgeois revolution that produced a form of state capitalism rather than a fully developed proletarian society. In his open letter to Lenin, Gorter had not yet come to view the Russian Revolution as anything but a proletarian victory, But even as early as 1921, Gorter arrived at a notion of Russia as having experienced a, quote, dual revolution, end quote, with a communist revolution against the bourgeoisie in the cities and a bourgeois revolution of the peasants against the feudal lords in the countryside. Gorter asserted that this contradiction was resolved in favor of the bourgeois side by the new government in 1921 with the introduction of the new economic policy. However, Gorter held this position for only a short time. Otto Rühle soon convinced Gorter that the Russian Revolution had been, quote, the last in the line of the great bourgeois revolutions of Europe, end quote. This became the general position of council communists across Europe and was supported by the increasing centralization and bureaucratization of the USSR. Pannekoek agreed that, quote, the Russian Revolution is a bourgeois revolution like the French Revolution of 1789, end quote. In a later letter to Castoriadis, Pannekoek nuanced his position by suggesting that although, quote, it was the last bourgeois revolution, end quote, it was, quote, carried out by the working class, end quote. While workers supported the revolution through mass action in the councils, the Bolsheviks succeeded in appropriating power from the councils and implementing a form of state capitalism. Councils as revolutionary process. Third, as a result of their criticisms of the bureaucratization of the Soviet state, council communists became less likely to emphasize the idea of the council system as an institutional blueprint of a new state form. For revolutionary shop stewards like Richard Müller and Ernst Daumig, who were at the center of the council struggles in Berlin in 1918 to 1920, the councils presented a new working-class system of government. Similarly, in Hungary and Bavaria, where short-lived, quote, council republics, end quote, were established in 1919, council delegates viewed these working-class governments as a new state form that was proletarian in character and could be radically distinguished from the institutions of the bourgeois state. This view is also present in Marx's text on the Paris Commune, which outlined a number of characteristics of this working-class government. In contrast, many of the theorists who became influential in the development of council communism used councils primarily as a strategic step in a process of revolutionary action toward a future stateless society. For Pannekoek, the importance of workers' councils lay in the underlying principle of revolutionary self-activity, rather than in a precise institutional proposal for a post-capitalist society. Quote, workers' councils does not designate a fixed form of organization, elaborated once and for all, and for which all that remains is to perfect its details. It concerns a principle, that of workers' self-management of the enterprise and of production, end quote. Pannekoek. Karl Korsch, in 1929, held a similar position, believing that there was an ambiguity in Marx's text on the Paris Commune between the idea of the commune as the finally discovered political form of working-class emancipation on the one hand, and his position that the value of the commune rested mainly on its formlessness and openness to transformation on the other. While a close reading of Marx's text indicates that Marx and Engels viewed the institutional structure of the commune as of great importance, Korsch attempted to resolve this contradiction in favor of the formlessness of revolutionary activity. Korsch argued that Marx did not go so far as to advocate the councils as the definitive form of revolutionary government. Rather, Korsch claimed that the final goal of proletarian struggle is, quote, the classless and stateless communist society, whose comprehensive form is not any longer some kind of political power, but is, quote, that association in which the free development of every person is the condition for the free development of all, end quote, end quote. It's a Korsch quoting Marx. This view of the councils was based on an acknowledgement that the revolution in the West would not be, quote, a single world-convulsing act, but a process of gradual change, end quote. Pannekoek writes, quote, "The revolution by which the working class will win mastery and freedom is not a single event of limited duration. It is a process of organization, of self-education, in which the workers gradually, now in progressing rise, then in steps and leaps, develop the force to vanquish the bourgeoisie, to destroy capitalism, and to build up their new system of collective production," end quote. Pannekoek's vision of the processual nature of the revolution stood against the dominant view of the revolution in the SPD as a series of consecutive and separate events in which a society would progress from one stage to another. If the revolution is envisaged as one single process, then it becomes more important that the means through which capitalism is fought are harmonious with the desired endpoint of a communist society. Quote, "Since the revolutionary class fight against the bourgeoisie and its organs is inseparable from the seizure of the productive apparatus by the workers and its application to production, the same organization that unites the class for its fight also acts as the organization of the new productive process," end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek began to understand the councils as prefigurative organizations which be used both in the fight against capitalism and as the nascent institutional foundations of a new communist society. As organs of revolutionary struggle, the councils could lay the groundwork for non-state institutions, which would evolve into the associational form of a post-capitalist society. He contended that, quote, "the workers' councils growing up as organs of fight will at the same time be organs of reconstruction," end quote. Pannekoek. Revolutionary leadership. Fourth, Council Communists approached the two interrelated questions of revolutionary leadership and the role of a communist party in political struggle from the same position of a suspicion of all forms of substitutionism. They understood this as the replacement of the revolutionary activity of the masses by an elite, whether party, trade union, or other leadership group. For greater clarity, these debates can be separated into two questions. The first question centered upon the appropriate relationship between a leadership and the masses. In other words, what role should committed revolutionaries play immediately preceding and during a revolution? A second debate within Council Communism concerned the relationship between the councils and a communist party. Council Communists took a variety of positions in relation to these issues, which were not always based on a complete rejection of the importance of leadership or a revolutionary party. To begin with, a supreme value is placed on the concept of the workers' self-emancipation rather than socialist forms legislated from above. As a result, one common principle shared by Council Communists was the necessity of mass action from as wide a section of the working class as possible. Regardless of their position on questions of parties and leadership, they all agreed that it would be desirable for as many workers as possible to be directly involved in revolutionary action. The majority of their criticisms of parties, unions, and parliamentary activity were based on the perception that these forms of organization and action would rob the workers of the opportunity to act for themselves. For example, Pannekoek criticized existing parties and unions to the extent that, in, quote, "these organizations, the actions and decisions of the leaders were substituted for actions and decisions of the workers," end quote. He considered that, quote, "action, the actual class struggle, is the task of the working masses themselves, ... Only the masses as a whole can achieve a victory," end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek's fear that the traditional models of leadership exercised by parties such as the SPD and Bolshevik Party inhibited revolutionary action of the masses themselves and led to their disempowerment. In his view, the leader's, quote, influence determines the politics and tactical line of the party, end quote, while the power of the members, quote, is nominal and illusory, end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek decisively rejected all forms of organization that relied on a command and control model of leadership in which leaders formulated all strategy and action plans to be obediently followed by party members. For Pannekoek, quote, the most tenacious and intractable element in this bourgeois mentality is dependence upon leaders, whom the masses leave to determine general questions and to manage their class affairs, end quote. Yet Pannekoek did not reject all forms of leadership and organization. The role of revolutionaries should be to assist the working class to, quote, bring clarity in their conflicts, discussions, and propaganda, end quote. Revolutionaries could play an important role as, quote, a means of propaganda and enlightenment, end quote. Throughout his life, Pannekoek struggled with balancing the strategic problem of how revolutionaries could develop class consciousness in the masses with his deeply held conviction that this should be a task for the masses themselves. He explicitly rejected all forms of tutelage and paternalism. His most frequent advice was that revolutionaries should advise, enlighten, and inspire, but not order, dictate, and command. In Pannekoek's view, workers should, quote, not blindly accept the slogans of others, but must think, act, and decide for themselves, end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek was more comfortable with the idea of leadership as education and propaganda than as strategic and organizational in nature. Pannekoek's belief that revolutions break out spontaneously among the masses due to long periods of spiritual development and revolutionary activity led Pannekoek, as of 1920, to avoid some of the more it says 1920. It's like a reference, so I don't know. Let me repeat the whole sentence. Pannekoek's belief that revolutions break out spontaneously among the masses due to long periods of spiritual development and revolutionary activity led Pannekoek to avoid some of the more practical questions of revolutionary leadership. In a letter to Castoriadis, Pannekoek questioned whether a revolutionary should act as a leader at all, preferring a more advisory role. Quote, our task is essentially theoretical, to find and indicate, through study and discussion, the best path of action for the working class, end quote. Pannekoek considered that it, quote, it will be up to them to decide the best way to act, but in order for them to decide the best way possible, they must be enlightened by well-considered advice from the greatest number of people possible, end quote. In his reply, Castoriadis suggested that a revolutionary organization must adopt a more robust approach. For Castoriadis, the task of revolutionary leadership is more than theoretical. It must be practically involved in, quote, struggle and organization, end quote. Castoriadis argued that a revolutionary organization, quote, must be capable of intervening in these struggles, combating the influence of bureaucratic organizations, proposing forms of action and organization to the workers. It must even at times be capable of imposing them. In these conditions, to say that a vanguard revolutionary organization will limit itself to, quote, enlightening with well-considered advice, end quote, is, I believe, what in English is called a, quote, understatement, end quote. End quote. Castoriadis. Other council communists would also disagree with Pannekoek's conception of leadership as propaganda. Herman Gorter concurred with Lenin that it would be necessary for a communist party to, quote, show the masses the way in all situations, not only in words, but also in deeds, end quote. You know, I'm curious, this is just me talking to myself, but I'm curious because, like, this citation is from 1921, and I think that that's, like, the KAPD era, and I think that council communism, as opposed to just, like, left communism, comes into its own somewhat later, even though, like, the figures that would make up the prominent thinkers of council communism are at this time still operating with a party conception of revolutionary organization. Not sure about all that, but that's just a thought I'm saying to myself. While Gorter agreed with Pannekoek that class relations in Western Europe necessitated a greater role for the masses over the leaders, he believed that Lenin's conception of leadership was still essentially correct. The problem of Gorter, 1920, was not Lenin's theory of leadership. The problem for Gorter in 1920 was not Lenin's theory of leadership, but the lack of effective leaders in Germany. Quote, "Here we are still seeking the right leaders, those that do not try to dominate the masses, that do not betray the masses, ... The leaders should form one united whole with the class and mass," end quote. Leadership was necessary for Herman Gorter because in their situation in the factories, workers would not be able to gain appropriate knowledge of the working class as a whole. It was therefore important for an advanced section of the working class to provide strategic analysis and to act as, quote, "the one clear and unflinching compass toward communism," end quote. His remarks mirror Marx and Engels' discussion of the role of the Communist Party in the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The Communists, therefore, are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all other sections. On the other hand, theoretically, the Communists have over the great masses of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the lines of march, the conditions, and ultimate general results of the proletarian movement," end quote. Marx and Engels. Communist Manifesto. In general, however, the emphasis of Council Communism was on the spontaneous and independent action of the working class, which led to a suspicion of actors and organizations that attempted to usurp the working class's self-activity and autonomy. This suspicion of leadership directly relates to another major issue, the appropriate role of a political party in revolutionary struggle. Revolutionary organization. Fifth, Lenin accused the, quote, left communist, end quote, of, quote, denying the necessity of the party and of party discipline, end quote. But there was less agreement among the council communists concerning the relationship between councils and party than he believed. The hardline position represented by Otto Rühle was an indiscriminate rejection of all political parties as fundamentally bourgeois and unrevolutionary. Rühle's views were shaped by his experience as a representative of the Social Democratic Party and later as a member of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, KAPD. Rühle's reasoning closely resembled Pannekoek's distrust of revolutionary leadership due to its deterring of mass political action. For Rühle, in a political party, quote, "the leaders have the first say. They speak, they promise, they seduce, they command. The masses, ... have to receive their orders and carry them out," end quote. Rühle. A second reason Rühle offered for his rejection of political parties was that once formed as political parties, organizations become pacified and incorporated into the system. They no longer engage in revolutionary struggle and instead begin to focus exclusively on making bargains and compromises. In the place of political parties, Rühle called for revolutionary factory organizations that could be organized factory by factory into a general workers' union, which would undertake economic and political functions. He advocated direct workers' control in a federal structure of councils outside of any party as the most effective means to pursue revolutionary transformation. Unlike Pannekoek, Rühle still held a more Leninist conception of a revolutionary vanguard who would lead the way in this struggle. Quote, "The most decisive and active elements, the most mature elements have to form themselves into a phalanx of the revolution." I don't know how to say that word. Let me look it up. Phalanx. Unlike Pannekoek, let me go back to reread it. Unlike Pannekoek, Rühle still held a more Leninist conception of a revolutionary vanguard who would lead the way in this struggle. Quote, "The most decisive and active elements, The most mature elements have to form themselves into a phalanx of the revolution. ... They are the elites of the new revolutionary proletariat. ... They demonstrate themselves as the vanguard of the proletariat, as an active will in relation to hesitant and confused individuals. At decisive moments, they form a magnetic center of all activity. They are a political organization, but not a political party. Not a party in the traditional sense. End quote. Otto Rühle. Not all Council Communists shared Rühle's rejection of political parties. In 1919 to 1920, Pannekoek still acknowledged the indispensable role of a communist party in political struggle. In, quote, World Revolution and Communist Tactics, end quote, Pannekoek outlined his understanding of the precise role of a communist party. Again, this is very early. This is in the early 1920s, which I think is pre-Council Communism era. But like I said, I'd have to check my references, which would be other sources on Council Communism, to ascertain whether what I'm saying is true or not. Anyway, in World Revolution and Communist Tactics, Pannekoek outlined his understanding of the precise role of a communist party. Quote, the function of a revolutionary party lies in propagating clear understanding in advance, so that throughout the masses there will be elements who know what must be done and who are capable of judging the situations for themselves. And in the course of the revolution, the party has to raise the program, slogans and directives which the spontaneously acting masses recognize as correct, because they find that they express their own aims in their most adequate form, and hence achieve greater clarity of purpose. It is thus that the party comes to lead the struggle. End quote. Pannekoek, 1920. While Pannekoek still believed in workers' self-emancipation and empowerment, at this stage, there is a focus on the decisive role of the party, a position which faded in Pannekoek's work in the 1930s and 1940s. So being corroborated by the text itself, at least in regards to Pannekoek. During this period, Pannekoek began to associate political parties with domination and became interested in exploring new organizational models of political struggle. Pannekoek's problem with political parties was that in practice they often aimed to, quote, seize power for themselves, end quote, rather than acting as, quote, an aid to the working class in its struggle for emancipation, end quote. The party, for Pannekoek, quote, is an organization that aims to lead and control the working class, end quote. A revolutionary party was, quote, a contradiction in terms, end quote. For a party, quote, cannot be other than an organization aimed at directing and dominating the proletariat, end quote. The central committee of a party had a tendency to become, quote, masters of the organizations, masters of the money as well as of the press, while the membership themselves lost much of their power, end quote. Pannekoek, 1938. As the Bolsheviks demonstrated, revolutionary parties would ultimately seek to seize power for themselves and create a dictatorship of party rule, which would exclude all opinions except their own. In a piece called General Remarks on the question of organization, Pannekoek considered new organizations that he referred to as, quote, parties or groups based on opinions, end quote, which he considered might become, quote, organs of the self-enlightenment of the working class, end quote. Rather than adopting a traditional top-down party structure, such groups would be more akin to reading circles or loosely organized propaganda groups, which would engage in educational activities among the workers in order to present political analyses and arguments. Elsewhere, he outlined the structure and role of these new, quote, opinion groups, end quote, as follows. Quote, persons with the same fundamental conceptions unite for the discussion of practical steps and seek clarification through discussions and propagandize their conclusions. Such groups might be called parties, but they would be parties in an entirely different sense from those of today. End quote. Pannekoek, 1936. In spite of the impractical nature of such a group and its questionable effectiveness in taking political action, Pannekoek was adamant that new organizational forms should not adopt the model of the Revolutionary Party. At his most critical, Pannekoek rejected all forms of parties, even putting forward a view that, quote, directly contradicts the traditional ideas about the role of the party as an essential educational organ of the proletariat, end quote. But to the extent that parties did exist, Pannekoek believed they should undertake educational and propaganda functions, while the council should be the main organs of political action. Quote, for the parties, then, remains the second function, to spread insight and knowledge, to study, discuss, and formulate social ideas, and by their propaganda to enlighten the minds of the masses. The workers' councils are the organs for practical action and fight of the working class. To the party falls the task of the building up of its spiritual power. Their work forms an indispensable part in the self-liberation of the working class, end quote. Pannekoek, 1936. A number of council communists and Marxists who supported workers' councils were less critical of political parties and defended the necessity of a traditional Marxist party alongside the councils. For example, Gorter did not deny the necessity of a centralized and disciplined party. Gorter was critical of comrades who used party maneuvers to exclude others and to function as a small minority clique, but Gorter primarily agreed with Lenin in the need for a robust communist party, which could act as a vanguard for proletarian revolution. Georg Lukács was another early advocate for councils who also believed in the need for a communist party. Following his conversion to Marxism in 1918, Lukács considered the councils an ideal institution for authentic proletarian political activity. Lukács was the deputy commissar of public education in the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic from April to August 1918 and participated in the political debate surrounding the council form. In his 1920 essay, Questions of Parliamentarism, Lukács described the councils as, quote, the true index, end quote, of the proletarian revolution whose mere existence, quote, points the way forward beyond bourgeois society, end quote. Lukács. Councils were viewed as exemplary institutions, which were the most advanced expression of working-class consciousness and organization. However, Lukács never completely abandoned his admiration for a Leninist party. His writings in this early period contain a mixture of support for both councils and a vanguard party. During the 1920s, in particular after Lenin's criticism of left communism, there was a general erosion of support for the councils and an increasing predominance of the party in Lukács' work. See, for instance, Jacobi, 1981. I believe that's Russell Jacobi. He's written on like the history of... He's like an intellectual historian. I think he's written on Western Marxism and a lot of other shit. Anyway, Antonio Gramsci, on the other hand, had a much briefer flirtation with the councils. Gramsci was a member of the Italian Socialist Party and in April 1919 began editing the weekly newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Let's see. Let's see what Google tells me to say. Italian. It's
L'ordine nuovo. L'ordine nuovo.
L'ordine nuovo.
L'ordine nuovo.
Nuovo. L'ordine nuovo. New order. Anyway. Gramsci was a member of the Italian Socialist Party and in April 1919 began editing the weekly newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo. In a series of articles written for the newspaper, Gramsci advocated for workers involved in political disputes in Turin companies to convert their factory commissions into workers' councils. Gramsci argued that such councils would be, quote, organs of proletarian power which will replace the capitalist in all his useful functions of direction and administration, end quote. Gramsci. However, the political failure of the Turin councils led Gramsci to conclude that the working class required a Leninist vanguard party to avoid further defeats. In contrast, Karl Korsch was a much firmer believer in the possibilities of the council system, serving as a delegate on one of the German soldiers' councils and on the Socialization Committee in 1918. In his conception, the councils were sovereign organs representing political and economic power of the proletariat. He called for a socialist republic of workers' councils in which they would hold full executive, legislative, and judicial power, thereby destroying the old bureaucracy and political structures of the bourgeois regime. In a 1921 essay, Evolution of the Problem of the Political Workers' Councils in Germany, Korsch was critical of the ideological confusions of those who preferred to exercise more oversight and control over existing governmental apparatuses, since this failed to recognize that for him were the true tasks of the councils. Some years later, Korsch, 1924, recognized that a revolutionary act required a mass revolutionary party to provide the necessary discipline and strategic direction, but this would only be a temporary step towards the ultimate goal of direct democracy of workers' councils. Korsch believed that the failure of the German Revolution was due to the ideological backwardness of the workers and the unpreparedness of the socialist leadership. As a result, Korsch attempted to support workers' councils as organs capable of developing the class consciousness and organizational capacity of the workers. I was just going to say that according to Douglas Kellner's book on Korsch, Korsch had changing views throughout his life. Not like, and there would be like one of the big changes would be, he had this kind of like councilist kind of idea in the early like revolutionary period in Germany. Then he became like a pretty like pretty standard Leninist in the KPD. I think he was like in parliament at one point as a member of the German Communist Party, and didn't come to really like councilist conclusions until later in the 1920s. So his development was a little bit different than the other people's. He kind of came, to my understanding at least of his intellectual biography, he came to council communist positions later. Like, he wasn't part of the first like generation of like council communists. That would be like Gorter and Rühle and Pannekoek and people like that. He got into it like after the movement kind of like died out as like or was like extremely weakened compared to what it was. I think when it initially formed, for instance, the KAPD, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, which was the left communist like break-off group from the Communist Party of Germany, had like thousands of members. I don't know the exact figures like off the top of my dome piece, but they had like they had some like connection to political movements. I think Korsch gets into council communism after that period. Anyway, Korsch believed that the failure of the German Revolution was due to the ideological backwardness of the workers and the unpreparedness of the socialist leadership. As a result, he attempted to support workers' councils as organs capable of developing the class consciousness and organizational capacity of the workers. New section. Participation in parliamentary elections. 6. The Council Communists argued against participation in parliamentary activity, covered similar ground to the rejection of political parties. Parliamentarianism promoted dependence on leaders and obstructs the revolutionary activity of the masses. In 1920, Lenin defended the use of parliamentary activity and trade unionism as an essential tactic in class struggle. The Council Communist rejection of these strategies became one of the main divides between the Dutch-German tendencies and the Comintern. Pannekoek believed that revolutionary struggle had reached a new stage in Western Europe following the end of the First World War, and that the communists needed to combat bourgeois mentalities among the masses, which were only further reinforced through participation in parliamentary elections. In order for there to be a development of class consciousness, he argued that the communists should break from parliamentary democracy. Pannekoek summarizes the position of the Council Communists in 1920 as follows, quote, "Parliamentarianism inevitably tends to inhibit the autonomous activity by the masses that is necessary for revolution. Fine speeches may be made in Parliament exhorting the proletariat to revolutionary action. It is not in such words that the latter has its origins, however, but in the hard necessity of there being no alternative." End quote. The arguments formed against parliamentary activity were played out in Lenin and Gorter's exchange of 1920. Lenin argued that the parliamentary struggle was far from, quote, historically obsolete, end quote, and still represented one of the primary domains of political contestation of the early 20th century. Participation in parliamentary activity is essential as a means to educate the masses and awaken bourgeois elements to socialist beliefs. Through their interaction with other parties, communists can make use of rifts between parties and encourage leftist elements in the parliament to radicalize their views. Lenin provided the example of Russia, where at key moments in the struggle the Bolshevik Party benefited from the propaganda they were able to carry out in parliament. Gorter took issue with Lenin's analogy to the Russian situation. Gorter argued that in Western Europe, quote, "the working masses in general are completely subjected, as far as ideas are concerned, to the bourgeois system of representation, to parliamentarism, to bourgeois democracy," end quote. Gorter. His central argument was therefore that, quote, "workers must in the first place act for themselves, ... because the workers stand alone, and because no clever tactics of leaders can help them," end quote. Parliamentarianism would only encourage workers to stay in a state of dependence on leaders and dissuade them from taking necessary revolutionary action to overthrow capitalism. Similar positions were taken by other council communists. The Workers' Socialist Federation in Britain did not participate in parliamentary elections because they saw it as, quote, "wasting energy," end quote. I think that was the group that was organized around Sylvia Pankhurst. Not exactly sure about that. There's another guy who was kind of like, he's sort of like a British left communist, or arguably, who was like kind of anarchist and had like a group around him of like anti-parliamentary, like very like libertarian communist around Guy Aldred. It's the guy, his main name that's coming to mind. Conclusion. Council communist tendencies developed during the 1920s, yet throughout the same period, workers' participation in council communist groups declined dramatically. In 1921, the KAPD had a membership of over 40,000. Okay, so yeah, I know what I'm talking about. And another 200,000 in the closely aligned, quote, "factory organizations," end quote, of the General Workers' Union of Germany, the AAUD. By the time Hitler took power, only a few small groups of the German left were still active. The Council Communist International Network, the Communist Workers International, KAI, was founded in 1922, but never fully materialized due to the dissolution of some of its member organizations. Even at its peak, it never contained more than 1,000 members, the KAI. By the 1930s, Council Communists only existed in tiny propaganda groups. The Dutch Group of International Communists, GIK, consisting of members such as Cajo Brendel, Henk Kana Major, and Paul Mattick. I'm not sure about those first names if I'm saying, I can't remember if Dutch, the J is a Z sound or a Y sound. So I might be pronouncing those names wrong. So keep that in mind. The Dutch Group of International Communists, GIK, consisting of members such as Cajo Brendel, Henk Kana Major, and Paul Mattick, formed in 1927 and published a number of important theoretical works in addition to the journal Reta Correspondence, Council Correspondence, Reta being the German word for council, so the equivalent of like Soviet in Russian. Paul Mattick and other German revolutionary émigrés in the United States also started the publication of International Council Correspondence in 1934, later entitled Living Marxism and the then New Essays. Many of the council communists, such as Karl Korsch, Antonie Pannekoek, and Otto Rühle, continued to write and publish some of their best work in these later years. However, the 1930s and 1940s were a period of decline for their political influence over workers' movements. This chapter has sought to develop a more complex picture of the development of council communist thought in the revolutionary period from 1917 to 1921. While a number of good studies currently exist on council communism by Philippe Boignet, Marcel van der Linden, Mark Shipway, and Peter Rachleff, this chapter has attempted to make two additional contributions. First, it has highlighted the essential role that debates around the German Revolution and the spread of international socialism to the West played in its ideological formation. Second, it has distinguished an early phase of the German Revolution and the revolutionary shop stewards held out hopes for the establishment of a council republic from later theoretical developments of council communist ideology. It has examined the conditions for this shift in political ideology and analyzed the central concerns which animated debates between key participants in the development of council communism in the early 1920s. There's a few notes here. That's the end of the essay, and there's a few notes here. There's just 3 of them, so I'll just read them. Endnote 1, Amadeo Bordiga in Italy and Sylvia Pankhurst in Italy held similar views. The Italian current of left communism formed around an idea of organic party centralism, which differed slightly from the Dutch-German current of spontaneous workers' councils. See Bordiga, 1919. Is it time for Soviets? Endnote 2. For an overview of these debates, see Boignet. For council communism in Great Britain, Italy, and Austria, see Pankhurst, 1920. I was going to say that the Boignet book is the book that's on council communism, or the Dutch-German communist left. It's available with Haymarket Books. I have it, but it's a big fat boy, and I don't feel like reading it again. I think Paul Mattick Jr. has a review of it, and I think I'm going to read that soon. 3. The 2 most important essays from the GIK, the Group of International Communists, were The Fundamental Principles of Production and Distribution, Communist Production and Distribution, The Origins of the Movement for Workers' Councils in Germany. For a detailed analysis of the activities of the Group of International Communists, see Boignet. Yeah. Thanks for listening.